still have conversations with Ken when I'm not sure about a particular moral choice I have to make or a judgment. I ask myself, what would Ken do? And frequently try to follow what I hear. I think all of what you're going to hear is drawn from conversations with him, because among the delights of my scholarly life were the years of listening to him listen to others. He had a great gift for listening. And the way in which he was able to pull sense out of wandering thoughts is, I know, a matter of record in this institution and in others. Now, what I wanted to do, though, is to talk about a project that I was never sure, and he was never sure, would reach the end and appear in print. And the reason, of course, was age, frailty, distance, time. But we've done it. And I can say that with the quartet, there are many other famous foursomes I think we can talk about in history, but with Carol, with Seamus, and with Bill, I've been able to keep my promise to Ken that I would move heaven and earth to get it done. And today I can say we are at that point. Editorial work, the meticulous scholarship that Ken observed all his life, that will take time. But I can tell you that Monash University publishers will get the volume 2 within a month or maybe 5 weeks. And it's up to them to get it published in 2019. That's what I hope that we can announce a date of publication and celebrate that event less than a year from now. Now, what I want to do today is to divide my remarks into 4 parts. The first tells of the genesis of the project and the way that Seamus, Bill, Carol, and I have tried to complete it. Always in mind that this is Ken's book. We are here to finish Ken's work. And every sentence that I've written in it, or every edited sentence of Ken's that I try to complete, since many of the chapters, many of the profiles were incomplete at the time of his death, I try to hear how Ken would say it. He had what I call a gift of Inglisian English. It's a very remarkable laconic style in which he could say more things in fewer words than most people that I know. And so this book and this story is about Ken's book, which we have now come close to completing and will finish shortly. The second part concerns problems embedded in the decision, which was Ken's, to write a visual history as the first part of Dunera Lives. The third part focuses on the logic of the second volume, the one just completed, or just about completed, which consists of profiles of individual lives and addresses some difficulties, some major problems of analysis and composition on which Ken, Seamus, Bill, and I have meditated over many years. In the third section, I confront several questions. How do the visual history, Volume 1, and the profiles fit together? And what are the discrete problems each presented to us as authors? And finally, in the fourth section, I ask what are the distinctive and original features of this 2-volume history of a particular cohort of people trapped by the Second World War in Britain and Singapore. The response I offer in a nutshell is that Dunera Lives, which is what Ken wanted it to be, is an attempt to write the history of a cohort of forced migrants who wound up in Australia and to tell of what happened to them and what they did before, during, and after the Second World War. What this story reveals about Australia, Britain, the Second World War, and about the 20th century as a whole is the point I would like to leave you with at the end of my remarks. Now, each time I asked Ken what were the origins of the Dunera project, I got a different answer. But at the core of each iteration was the desire of a modest man, an extremely modest man, to tell the story of a chapter of his early life without writing about himself. There was one time, I think Seamus had more to do with this than I did, there's a photograph in Volume 1 of Ken as a student at the University of Melbourne. He was dead set in getting rid of it. He simply wanted this not to be about him, but about a group of people he saw when he was young and found remarkable. Now, what happened as an undergraduate at the University of Melbourne, he met a group of older men, European intellectuals who had been deposited on Australian shores by the tsunami of the Second World War. One of them, Franz Philipp, distinguished art historian, had made his way from Dachau to London to Sydney on board the Dunera. On his release, he studied at the University of Melbourne, and after coming top of his class, began his teaching career at the university. One of his students was Ken Inglis, whose talents he recognized immediately. "Why not consider following an academic career?" Philip said to Ken, and the rest is history. Over the years, Ken got to know well a number of other men who had come to Australia on the Dunera, and with all the insights Amira Inglis brought to him about what it meant to be a newcomer in Australia, Ken set about his project with meticulous and patient scholarship. The results were huge files of material organized somewhat idiosyncratically and with copious notes, many of them legible only to Ken and maybe to God, on what to follow up and what was still to discover about the nearly 3,000 men and women who came to Australia in 1940 on board the Dunera and on board the Queen Mary. He began collecting material for his book on the Dunera story more than a decade before his physical decline set in, following a knee replacement surgery, or 2 or 3, which left him wheelchair bound. The first operation was conducted not long after Ken and Amira had moved from Canberra to Melbourne to be nearer their family. Amira remained physically fit, but her memory began to cloud. Under these new circumstances, Ken began to rethink his project. Watching an Anzac Day match on television together, Ken and I talked over various alternatives. The least attractive to me was the one I mentioned, Casualty, at halftime. I joked that if worst came to worst, I could join him as author, dismissing this idea as impossible since I was anything but an Australian historian. To me, this offer was a throwaway line, but Ken, to my great surprise, didn't throw it away. He didn't say anything until the game was over and said, "Agreed." That's why I'm here today. What made this partnership possible was the generosity of Ray Francis, then Dean of Arts at Monash University. Ray immediately saw what Ken needed to finish the job. I was already on board as a visiting professor at Monash, and Ray generously increased the support, enabling me to work with Ken on the project. The next step was critical. Ray funded the appointment of a research assistant, Seamus Spark. Now, when Seamus joined the collective, Ken saw right away that despite his and Amira's difficulties, there was a good chance that indeed he could finish the Dunera project, and it mattered to him to complete it. Initially, he saw it as a single volume, but he began to wonder whether it would be wise to aim at a second volume, one focusing on visual images, in case he didn't make it to the end of the second volume, to be organized around profiles of individual Dunera and Queen Mary people. Now, each time I came to work with Ken in Melbourne, we repeated a formula, and it was explicit and it was meant. The moment that Ken said that he was unable to go forward with the book was the moment we would call it a day. Every time I came, 10 times, 15 times over the course of the last years, I said to Ken, "Is this the day we say, that's it?" Each time he said no. The most important reason I think that that moment never arrived, despite Amira's passing in May 2015 and Ken's multiple handicaps, was the presence of Seamus Spark. Now, Seamus provided Ken with every kind of support a man could ask, but he did more than that. He took the challenge of creating a constellation of images, paintings, documents, letters, caricatures, sculptures, and made it happen. It was Seamus who not only scoured dozens of archives at home and abroad for material, but also ordered the images, both chronologically and thematically. Volume 1 of Dunera Lives was the outcome of Seamus's initial shaping of the subject, which was adjusted by Ken and me, changed over time, but nonetheless started with Seamus. At times, Ken was guilty of what I would call academic or intellectual greed. He would urge Seamus on, saying, for example, "We can't possibly publish the book without an image of men playing handball in Tatura." And Seamus immediately found 1 or 2 or 3. Or without an extended discussion, Ken insisted, with images of the variety show Sergeant Snow White that also had to be there. No question about the essential nature of these editions. Now, it is important, I think, to realize that the result of this was to balloon Volume 1 from the 350 images we promised to Monash University Publishers to the 500 images Nathan Hollier of Monash University Publishing was shocked to receive in early 2018. And I came across a line in one of Ken's early correspondence, I think it's with the Schlosser Castle family, who said he was interested in writing a small book. Well, Ken's mind was not small, and his imagination expanded to create the space in which we made these two books. It is important to note that Seamus's work didn't end when he found the image needed on a theme or an event. He ensured that the publisher had not only high-resolution images, but also the written permission of the hundreds of copyright holders to use their property. So my part in this effort was in caption writing, which is an art form, and in creating the general introduction to the series, to the two volumes, the sectional introductions to various parts of it, and concluding prose needed to give readers enough knowledge to appreciate the visual feast to follow and to savor. Carol Bunyan offered a revealing list of the name changes Dunera men adopted during or after the war, enabling us to use their original names after 1945 and their newly chosen names thereafter. I would particularly like this because my grandfather got the name Winter on a boat because the immigration officials in New York simply couldn't pronounce the Russian or the Polish names. She also provided the statistics for graphs showing the timing of the liberation of individual members of this captive population. Most importantly, she provided, I think, the most important archive on which the two volumes is based, an extraordinary database on each and every internee and deportee who appeared in the book and on many who did not. For us, her work was both essential and a godsend. One idea I had on how to finish the project failed utterly. I have spent my life on collective work, designing a museum, producing a television series, writing a two-volume study of capital cities at war with 20 other scholars, every one of the juniors of which got a job, I might add. Now, as Ken found writing increasingly difficult and using a computer increasingly frustrating, I urged him to consider that we write the book together. I've done this many times. In other words, he would speak and I would compose with the computer. This worked with 3 books on population history I wrote with a demographer friend, but when Ken and I tried it, absolutely nothing happened. Fortunately, as Ken's health declined, his capacity to adapt his habits of a lifetime increased. With Seamus, he was able to listen to various drafts of introductions and captions and to choose the wording he preferred. Always Ken had the last word, and in trying to finish the profiles of Volume 2, I just wish I could ask him, first of all, what does this indecipherable comment mean? But also, what's the right choice of words to end the particular thought? He always had that, and if he didn't have it, the Australian the dictionary of Australian English would have the answer. Yes, I think it's important to note that Ken had the last word, and Volume 2, I believe, is one that he would give his, shall we say, benign approval to. It is a collective work, but it is first and foremost Ken's book. It is also a meditation on the fate of exiles who escaped persecution in Germany and Austria only to suffer internment in Britain and deportation to Australia. On this theme, each of the authors added her or his insights. Volume 2 of Dunera Lives is a collective work in another sense. Many of the chapters were begun by Ken. One profile of Henry Mayer was published in a scholarly journal before his death, and Ken saw the proofs of another profile of Leonard Adam, which was published after his death on the 1st of December 2017. The others, all of them, there are 20, we profiled 20 people in Volume 2, have been completed by Bill Gammett, Seamus Spark, and me with Carol Bunyan's verification, commentary, and I hope blessing. Now, not long before Ken's death, Robert Dare of the University of Adelaide, and a friend of Ken and mine, accepted my invitation to help complete Volume 2. Again, not being an Australian historian was a clear disadvantage. I needed that weight alongside me. Ken welcomed his addition to the team. Unfortunately, just the day before Ken's memorial service, Robert suffered a major stroke and could not continue in the project. On the very day of Ken's memorial service, I asked Bill Gamage to take Robert's place, and thank God he agreed to put aside his own work and to serve as co-author. It's been a pleasure working with this quartet, and it's one of the beliefs in my life that we in the Academy, and maybe those of you in high administration, undervalue collective work and overvalue the authorial voice of one single person. Some projects like this one are simply too big for one, and yet the Academy doesn't recognize the power that the collective is greater than the sum of its parts. Now, the first volume provides a series of images. And I know I talked to Ken at some length about W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz, in which image and text flow into each other. There are not captions in Sebald because the images are textual and the text is filled with imaginary images. This was something that fascinated Ken, and it was something that led him to try to use the visual, I think, in an original way. His idea was at the core of the first volume. Now, the emphasis, as I said, was on visual material, much of which, by definition, is ephemeral. That is, a photograph captures a moment and no more, and we almost never can tell what was outside the boundaries of the photo itself. Volume 1 focuses mostly on faces. We have the face of Bern Brent, whom I'm happy to acknowledge is among us today, when he was at his home holding up a glass in celebrating his family just before his departure. We have faces, we have portraits, we have family images of all kinds, but we can never really see what was outside the boundary of the photo itself. It's not possible. It's simply beyond the photographic image. Volume 1 focuses on faces, sights, and moments and relies upon captions to offer the reader sufficient information to understand what she sees. In many instances, the meaning of the image may be contextualized but never fully known. Let's see if I can actually work this. Some of them are formulaic, and of course that's because photographers earn money from families, and families need staged photographs. Now, what we see here are two photographs, one of father and son in the North Sea, Carl and Fritz Lowenstein, and later Fred Lowen, and Felix and Fred Bischofswerder. Felix Werder is on the left. But what that says about these couples, as it were, is a mystery. And in the case of Felix and Fred, something I don't know very much about, the relationship between the two of them. This is what families like to see. This is what the market requires. So photography frequently is limited by genre. It's limited by market demands, and it becomes stylized. I know this from as an historian of the First World War. The number of posed photographs in the First World War is gigantic. Unfortunately, quite a few of them have been posed with strapping young Australians today in the Monash Information Center on the Somme. It's the same mistake to assume that an image is, by definition, has verisimilitude attached to it. It shows truth. And in most cases, I believe, photographs show everything but truth. We can come back to that later if you wish. Now, it seems to me that the contextualization of this is very difficult, cheek to cheek on one side, hand to hand on the other. In the late 1930s, the photograph on the right was taken. In the 20s, the photograph on the left. They suggest affection, but aside from the convention of making families happy, what can we find out about these people? The captions we wrote for them help situate them, but they remain flashes of reality, discrete moments and probably forced moments. Let us pose them, as it were, alongside later sightings. Here's one example. There is boy on left, honorary doctor on right. The same person. Felix Werder, who changed his name, gets an honorary degree 60 years later in 2002 in Melbourne. Or let's juxtapose Fritz Lowenstein, age 6 or so in the water, with the same man, now Fred Lowen, in 1946 making wooden salad bowls in his newly adopted city. Fred is the same man. The photos show 2 split seconds of reality. While the captions do their work, and help us identify the person in the moment. What is missing is time, is the sense of process, of time passing, of evolution, of change. Connecting the dots, providing us much documented information as possible about the trajectory between early and later lives requires to move beyond the photograph, to move beyond the visual. However full we make the captions in an effort to explain why the photos are there. I once asked a very interesting photographer whether captions ever capture photographs. His view is that most people don't read them. I'm surprised. I thought, my view is that captions are actually, and his view, which I think was very interesting, it says the photograph has a caption in it. We may put one under it, but that's a mistake. Well, these are all analytical problems of dealing with visual history, of which Ken was well aware. And that's why he agreed from the beginning that we needed a second volume, one providing life histories or profiles based on all kinds of documents taken from many different sources. Only when we put these profiles together with these portraits do we reach something like a conjuncture of place and time, a mixture of text and context, of structure and individual agency, which enables us to do justice to the lives these people lived. Now, when we consider the works of art, and there are many of them in Volume 1, quite remarkably and beautifully reproduced by Monash University Publishing, when we consider the works of art produced by many of these people, we are even more aware of the need for a longitudinal study of individual lives. It is an error, many critics argue, to read a work of art through the life of an artist. That is true enough. But when we look at a number of works of art provided by men who reached Australia on the Dunera, leaving the works to speak for themselves, as it were, is just not an option. Let's take this one. This is a near iconic image designed by Ludwig Hirschfeld Mach, later an art teacher, distinguished art teacher at Geelong Grammar School, and reproduced many times. It shows a starry night and a single man standing on one side of a barbed wire fence looking at the heavens. Later it took on the name Desolation, though Hirschfeld Mach was not the man who gave it that name. Is that what he intended? We don't know. What did he intend by this one? It's a wood sculpture called Yes, Sir, which is actually in the Australian War Memorial here in Canberra. It shows a prisoner much bigger than the camp he dwarfs. Consider the problem of ascribing meaning to another image, a university scene drawn by Leonard Adam. It is entitled After Lunch, but it is difficult to discern the artist's point of view. In fact, I should have said, I find it difficult, but in a collective work, I'm going to use the third person plural pronoun. We found it difficult to figure out what is going on here. Was he a man apart? Adam, certainly he had a sense of his own abilities. Older than these college boys, lazing in the winter sun. Was it their shadows that interested them? Was it surface, the way many artists are interested in the tableau itself? This problem is even more evident in trying to interpret this one, Klaus Friedeberger's Black Rock, Melbourne of 1942, a painting within the domain of erotic surrealism. By the way, all these images are in Volume 1. These images require interpretation, and their standing as evidence of the turn of mind of the Dunera generation is a very open question. To ascribe Friedeberger's erotic longings to the rest of the population is something that it would take a braver man than I to do. Sometimes a work of art just is. Consequently, we realized that the interpretation of this visual archive was essential but not sufficient to produce a full history of the Dunera generation. What we needed, in effect, was to complement the richness of Volume 1 with individual and collective histories of change over time. We needed to sketch lives and trajectories in such a way that we could reach, if possible, all the things we cannot see in the visual history. That's the reason for my title. Only by braiding together Volume 2 with Volume 1 could we do justice to the complex history we approach and that Ken had set on to write. It would be foolish, though, to adhere to a too rigid distinction between visual and textual sources. All sources in every kind of art and writing have their inherent limitations, which must be searched for and recognized. Captions can mark a point on a trajectory of radical change or of enduring immobility. Our reading of images depends on other sources which have provided us with other relevant information. But these external sources also have their traps and delusions, well known to anybody who's done archival research. Archives are maddeningly silent, Ken's included, on the issues we need to clarify, because the sources were not produced with historians in mind. Furthermore, we need to, as well, to attend to our own personal biases, which can lead us to misread a photograph or a textual document or a work of art like this one. We spent, I don't know how many hours it was, Seamus, working out, is that hat hiding an erection? And this is what we sat next to Ken's bed in Melbourne working out what is going on in this image. And it is inevitable that young men and not so young men who were deprived of female companionship might very well reach the stage of erotic surrealism. Now, when we constructed, I think, Volume 2, we faced other problems as well. The first is a selection of profiles. This is very difficult. Ken never did make a full choice, because if it had been in his, as it were, in his will, in his giving, there would be 60 portraits. Life is too short for that, unfortunately. He wanted everybody in if he possibly could, and the profiles were chosen to a degree arbitrarily depending upon our latest conversation with him. We don't claim that they are representative of the group as a whole, partly because we don't think there is one Dunera history, but many of them. Nor do we offer an explanation as why one individual is in and others are out. Instead, we follow the choices that Ken made in the last months of his life. We took time and again about the shape of Volume 2 while still engaged in finishing Volume 1. Ken was always in favor of more profiles, while I was in favor of those we could complete in a relatively short time, which, though unstated, meant before Ken's death. I wanted the first volume done so he could see it. He did improve. We didn't make it to Volume 2, but in September 2017 in Ken's room in Melbourne, Seamus, Ken, and I, alongside Graham Davison, who just came to say hello, popped open a bottle of champagne to celebrate the end of Volume 1. Actually, it took another 4 months to complete, but we were so close to success, or at least I felt that way, that I decided to declare that we had reached the end of the marathon a few miles short. Seamus ran the rest of it. So the choice we made in Volume 2 was based on Ken's interests and predilections. The people whose profiles appear in Volume 2 were people Ken found arresting. There are many others whom he found arresting, about whom we have not written. Now, some of these people he knew, others he knew from afar, but all of them were documented in the fascinating files he had accumulated over the years. As I said, to have satisfied Ken, we would have needed at least 2 volumes, maybe 3. Such was his affection for these men and his curiosity about their lives. I can still see in my mind's eye the gentle smile he had when conjuring up images of Roy Talheimer being dandled on Krupskaya Lenin's knee in the Kremlin, or of Tip Broughton giving leave for the Sabbath to the Jewish men under his command in the 8th Employment Company. Ken was a master of irony and relished the ironies of history he confronted. The second problem in constructing Volume 2 relates to what sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls the biographical illusion. In a nutshell, this argument is that if anything has emerged from philosophy, art, poetry, and film of the last century, it is that there is no such unity as one continuous and integrated self. The I to which each of us refers is a composite, and at times a jarringly contradictory composite with elements at war with each other. No one in a post-Freudian age can think otherwise. The challenge, therefore, is to write profiles without integrating the story of each internee into an artificially coherent whole. Admittedly, recognizing this rule is easier said than done. The second part of Bourdieu's challenge is to address the problem of human agency. He was a sociologist of what he termed the social surface, or the social field, that set of power relationships which enable some people to lead lives in which they make decisions about other people's lives. These social settings are more dominant than most of us like to think. a point of which Ken Inglis was well aware. He challenged the notion of a coherent life history and of an integrated personality in one great book, his great book on Max Stewart. And here's where I would claim that Bourdieu, in fact, was someone with whom, without the jargon, Ken Inglis was very familiar. Here was a man accused of the rape and murder of a 9-year-old girl in Australia, in South Australia. Ken's view, after long study, and I cite what he said to me, Ken's view after long study was that he probably did it, but that no black man could get justice in South Australia at that time, with the death sentence still intact. But the story did not end with Stewart's conviction and the commutation of his death sentence to life in prison. It went on to include his emotional growth in jail, aided by a Roman Catholic priest, and his return to life after 14 years in Yale prison. I remember well Ken's delight in having a chance to meet Max Stewart long after the events on which he wrote. We should note that, though through his writing, and here I'm not sure, but I believe this is true, through his writing, Ken may have helped save Stewart's life. Here was an instance in which Ken Inglis, the investigative journalist, took pride of place, and Ken Inglis, the historian, followed after, writing an eloquent postscript to the Stewart book, originally published in 1961. I was with him after his visit with Stewart in 2001, which left him with the same puzzle he saw during Stewart's trial decades before. Stewart, wearing cowboy hat and boots, and almost certainly aware of Ken's view that he was probably guilty, volunteered these words, which I heard from Ken's recording of them. And this is Max Stewart, and I quote, "Some people think Elvis is alive. Some people think he isn't. Some people think I was guilty. Some think otherwise," end quote. No resolution, just an ongoing puzzle. For a host of reasons, Ken was averse to heroic history, which consisted of a semi-religious narrative of early life travails and redemption. And that was why he never tried to give Max Stewart an identity, a life history in which he transcended great barriers and tests to emerge as an elder of his people, in time to grant Queen Elizabeth permission to traverse his and his people's lands. In the same way, Ken wanted to bring the Dunera story out of the realm of hagiography and insert it firmly in the realm of history. This means exploding myths. About twice as many internees, over 1,300, left Australia as stayed here after the war. The internees were not all Jewish, and only a small proportion engaged in the rituals and disciplines of daily and traditional Jewish life. But even when we knew, due to the diligence of Carol Bunyan's scholarship, that the Dunera story was more than an Australian story, it still presented a challenge. In a nutshell, the problem is how to record the multiple stories of lives after internment without creating a false impression that all internees were intellectuals or artists or heroes. For Ken and the rest of us in the historical profession, hero worship is the kiss of intellectual death. The last word Ken Inglis wanted in either volume of Dunera Lives is contribution, and I remember checking the first volume to make sure it wasn't there. A search mechanism, search and destroy, to make sure the word contribution out. Ken's gently disapproving smile would appear when he heard or read sentiments like these, and I quote one missive. "The Dunera boys made sterling contributions to Australian life, which would have been much poorer without them. They showed that with pluck and patience, anyone can transcend injustice," unquote. I can tell you which person wrote that later on. Ken was a man averse to the sociological language of men like Bourdieu, but as I said earlier, he was not at all far from their thinking. His hope, which we have shared, is to write about 20 men, a mere 1% of the total, in order to do justice to their lives, but also to explode any notion that they represented the whole, or that the whole had one special feature which set them off from their neighbors. I might add, one of the profiles of Heinz Schlosser, or Henry Castle, is really the story of his wife, Faye. We recognize the gender imbalance of the story, but Faye is astonishing. I would urge anyone, when Volume 2 comes out, start with Faye, and I think you'll find Ken at his best. This is one of the profiles that he didn't quite finish, but in finishing you can see the sheer delight of watching a master at work. We did need to recognize that we weren't going to tell the story of the women and children interned in Australia who came on the Queen Mary, other than through one profile of Karl Duldig and his family. Thus, we have provided only a window onto the world of these internees, while accepting that our account is in no sense definitive, or that it has a particularly uplifting message. History can be believed, especially the history of the 20th century, was disturbing, dazzling, much more than it was ennobling or enlightening. It tells us more about accident than about intention, more about contingency than about free will. One way to put this point with greater clarity is to ask Marx's question, did the Dunera men make their own lives? Marx's answer, I think, still stands. Yes, that's true, but not entirely in the way they thought they did. What we historians offer, and here I can cite numerous conversations with Ken, is to marvel at the variety of men's and women's responses to events which surprise and at times overwhelm them. Whether Ken believed in God is an open question. I've had yes, no, and maybe. There are all kinds of ways of construing various sentiments at different points in times. But I do know that he enjoyed the joke I told him years ago that if you want to hear God's laughter, just tell him of your plans and intentions. Now, right from the beginning, therefore, this project was set against the tradition of the lives of the saints. Ken brought to it a feeling not only for past injustices, but for present ones. And here may be a point in which we can speak of Dunera Lives not as having an explicit message, but as having an openness to the turbulent and frequently tragic fate of refugees from racial persecution and war over the past 100 years. Now, Inglis was one of them, and yet Dunera Lives is not her history. It is the story of men, women, and children who were in the wrong place at the wrong time and wound up losing their freedom because of that fact. In 1938 and 39, German and Austrian refugees and others alongside them were received by many groups in Britain with generosity and compassion. The history of the Kindertransport shows liberalism at its best, but we need to recognize while these children were saved, their chance of ever being reunited with their families trapped in the Third Reich was very slight, certainly after September 1939. A year later, in May 1940, official panic at the possible presence of fascist spies among Italians and Germans or Austrians living in Britain showed British illiberalism at its worst. It didn't begin with Brexit, believe me. First, 800 men died on board the Arandora Star, many of them harmless merchants from Italian families, pizza shop owners in Scotland, on board a ship torpedoed en route to Canada. Most of the survivors of that disaster were herded onto the transport ship, the Dunera, and they were joined by another 1,300 or so internees en route, this time, even though they didn't know it at the beginning, for Australia. They were kept in internment camps at Hay, Orange, and Tatura, and from April 1941, long after the Dunkirk crisis had passed, and fears of the invasion of Britain had receded almost to the vanishing point, they were given various options to gain their freedom. Roughly 450 returned to serve in British forces before the end of 1941. After Japan joined the war and threatened Australia in late 41, others were given the choice of joining Australian forces in a non-combatant unit, the 8th Employment Company. Roughly 640 took that pathway out of internment to the 8th Employment Company, which Ken always liked to refer to, and some did too, as the 8th Enjoyment Company. It's a non-combatant group of stevedores, basically, among other services. Later in the war, when berths on board ships could be found for them, other former internees went back to Britain. Some lost their lives when their ships were torpedoed. Most made it back to Britain or elsewhere. Some Italian internees returned to Britain only after the end of the war. They didn't want to take the risk. Less than 700, a clear minority of the original population that wound up in Australian internment, stayed in Australia. But wherever they went, I believe they had suffered two kinds of loss, and I did talk at length with Ken about this. The first was of their mother tongue, the familiarity of neighborhood and family, the idea that life had a familiar structure, which had brought parents and children together in Berlin or Vienna, and which would do the same for the next generation. Not so during the Nazi years, especially when Nazi racial laws made Jews out of people for no other reason than their ancestors were Jewish. Those who made it to Britain, in fact, Faye castles told her children that she was Jewish only in the last year of her life. They didn't know. This is the, as it were, the absurd, tragic comedy of Nazi racial laws. Now, in some respects, I think what we have to understand is that those who made it to Britain had already known disruption and a kind of cognitive dissonance which afflicts those who try to live in a place where they weren't born and in a language they knew at best only partially. Living in Paris today, I know of what I speak on this particular point. Try to get a plumber to do a job without having insults at your disposal that any 4-year-old who's been to a French kindergarten knows. You lose something when you leave your country, and one of them is the capacity to insult easily. Now, some immigrants, no, it can be picked up. I'm sure there's a road to knowledge of Australian insults there too. Now, some immigrants, it is true, came to England absolutely fluent in English. That's true. But most were not as fluent as that, and some didn't have more than the rudiments of the language. Understanding jokes, not to mention different English accents, or the rules of British conversation in which the chief aim is to avoid embarrassment, were beyond them. More than the English Channel separated these refugees from their homes in Germany or Austria or elsewhere. But the Dunera population suffered a second set of losses, perhaps even harder to take than the first. They were turned into enemy aliens who were deemed to constitute a potential threat to the people who had given them refuge just a few months or years before. They were arrested, in turn deported and incarcerated in camps in New South Wales and Victoria. Insult, therefore, inevitably was added to injury. Such a set of injustices, in some cases, not in all, left scars. Now, it is easy to say that they were the lucky ones. Hitler could not get his hands on them. Neither would they suffer in London during the Blitz. Many lost family members who were unable or unwilling to flee before flight became impossible. Imagine what the Dunera internees did not know during their time at Hay or Tatura or Orange. They didn't know whether their families were alive or dead. The world had indeed turned upside down, and their disorientation, and not only theirs, of course, was entirely understandable. The disorientation of people at war who were not internees needs to be kept in mind too. Australia is a society at war with the unknown, being part of the lives of most families, is the general case. The Dunera population were part of that. Doubly exiled, first to Britain and then to Australia, many of them started their working lives in Australia during one of the most sustained periods of economic and demographic growth in Australian history after 1945. Those who returned to Britain had a harder time during the austere post-war years, but those who made it to Canada, the United States, and even to Europe lived through what the French call les Trente Glorieuses, the boom years, 1945 to 75. Some made Aliyah and helped turn Palestine into Israel. Others went back to Germany to build the two new Germanys, East Germany and West Germany. In sum, the social surface of post-war Australia, North America, and Europe was wide open to men and women of talent in business, the arts, and science. These were the years of massive capital investment, and from the 1960s of the most spectacular expansion of higher education since the English Reformation. From 1960 to 1990, the number of people worldwide enrolled in colleges and universities trebled, and so did the number of jobs for the academics among the Dunera population. The third quarter of the 20th century was also the time when the Holocaust entered centrally into the history of the Second World War. It wasn't there when I started as an historian in the 1960s, but by the late 1970s and 80s, it was there. And it accompanied a worldwide commitment, at least in principle, to hold governments to account with respect to their record on human rights. The majority of the United Nations only signed the protocols attached to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1970. That's the moment, I believe, when a certain kind of association between remembrance and human rights became part of political activism on all levels. These developments gave exiles like the Dunera men a standing within the communities in which they lived. They could speak to the young and offer them a warning about the dangers of prejudice and hatred. Was the story they told, and still tell, a Jewish story? The answer is yes and no, in the sense that the history of anti-Semitism and the persecution of the Jewish people is both particular and universal. The majority of internees were identified as Jewish by Nazi racial laws. A minority, as many as 200, probably less, ate kosher food and prayed every day in the camps. That food was provided by sympathetic authorities after some struggle. A Jewish spokesman, Moritz Lissauer, demanded and at times received promises that internees returning to Britain would have kosher food on their voyage back. This, by the way, drove around the bend a number of military men who had to deal with them, Australian military men who had to deal with them. Most of the Jewish internees, though, and I'm using the word in inverted commas, were not observant and took out of Jewish tradition either nothing at all, which is a perfectly legitimate choice, or a variety of words, sensibilities, jokes, and memories that they interpreted in different ways before, during, and after internment. Most of the men on the Dunera were what Isaac Deutscher called non-Jewish Jews, forced into flight and then internment by Nazi racial laws and British fears of a fifth column in mid-1940. Their story was both specifically Jewish and very much like those of millions of non-Jewish refugees fleeing racial hatred or fascism in the 1930s and 40s, or of persecuted groups in other parts of the world. The term genocide and Holocaust became signifiers of murderous crimes states committed against many different groups, their own citizens. And indeed, the terms were signifiers of the need to prevent these crimes in the future. That is why the remembrance of Nazi crimes against Jews and many other persecuted people who were murdered during the Second World War or after became important for all liberal societies, both before and after the fall of communism in 1991. Now, for other reasons, the Dunera story also fitted into a worldwide memory boom. I think I'm the person who invented that term, born of the two world wars. Because of the relative affluence of post-war societies, new museums and films and archives emerged to document the suffering of the innocents in the 20th century. The Dunera passengers, alongside the Queen Mary passengers, were among them. Audio and video recordings became readily available, and after the invention of the internet, the recording, storage, and retrieval of narratives about the two world wars, in and out of uniform, became a matter of universal access. Everyone could hear the stories of those who had lived through these dark moments in the past. And though this past was not shared universally, many parallel stories have emerged. There were boat people from Vietnam. I think it was Stephen Castles who said, he keeps thinking when he looks at the news that my dad was a boat person. Not everyone shared this view. I think it's very important to agree. Was the Dunera population kin to the men on the boats from Vietnam, or on those who were part of the Palestinian or the Syrian diaspora? When millions of civilians fled wartime Yugoslavia after it imploded in the 1990s, is this the same story? And yet, even without a clear consensus, since not all Dunera men would agree, everybody's story is unique. We still, I think, find something to take with us from this story and from so much of our conversations with Ken that went into it. The leitmotif of much of this story, and indeed of much of the last 100 years, is the conversion of war into violence against civilians, and the vulnerability of ordinary people to the power of states to turn them into what the Italian philosopher Agamben calls bare life, with no law to protect them. Yes, after the Second World War, most found ways to restart their lives, get married, have families, earn a living, make a mark, and pass on their stories and their wisdom to the next generation. We must not lose sight of the painful facets of their lives, though, as refugees and internees, their anger at their treatment, the suffering many went through. I still cling to a conversation I had with Ken not long before he died. What he said was that after surveying the Dunera story for decades, he felt less impressed by what they had accomplished and more moved by what they had endured. There, but for the grace of God, go us all, was what I said to him, followed by a slight nod and a smile on his great landscape of a face. Perhaps this is one way to understand the story told in these two volumes. Another way is to reflect on the adaptive talents of the men and women who were forced to construct new lives during and after internment. Some were naturally gifted and used their skill in writing or painting or playing music to restore a kind of equilibrium to their daily lives. Others drew on the sociability of others and joined an astounding array of groups, teams, and associations which flourished, in particular in Hay and Tatura. Those isolated had a harder time than those who were integrated into collectives which engaged in practices which offered a rhythm and a regularity to what was effectively empty and limitless time. Religious services offered to some such fixed dates, and hearing the Psalms or the Torah gave a shape to their days and weeks and hope for the future. Once liberated, their adaptation took so many forms. Those who joined the 8th Employment Company had to adapt to their status and their uniforms, and after an awkward start, many did so with aplomb. Those who returned to Britain had to put up with the rigidities of army life and the stupidity behind the decision to make these men serve in a labor battalion because they weren't British. Later on in the war, some bright spark in the British Army, there are one or two, noted that many of them spoke very good German. That insight opened the door to a group of former internees, including Anton Freud, Sigmund's grandson, to serve as intelligence agents, to act as translators and parachute behind enemy lines. Others took part in combat, including the invasion of Normandy and the battles of the Bulge and the Battle of Okinawa. In the post-war years, the adaptive talents of these men led them to carve out careers in an astonishing array of fields. Some did better than others, but all were helped by the buoyant economic conditions of post-war life, especially but not only in Australia. Ken Inglis saw the way the Dunera generation in the University of Melbourne seized the opportunities they were offered. Some had to go over the ground of undergraduate or professional study again, since their European credentials were not recognized in England or Australia or anywhere else. But once launched, most moved into post-war civilian life with gusto. Just like everybody else, they married quickly after the war and had their children relatively early in their marital lives. They joined the baby boom, just as they joined the labor force, and most prospered with their neighbors and fellow workmates and colleagues. When they joined the memory boom of the fourth quarter of the 20th century and created groups like the Dunera Association to tell their story and celebrate their survival, they were like many other citizens of Australia or Britain or North America. They were witnesses to turbulent times, had a story to tell their children, others, in schools and at home. Retirement gave them time to do so, and they knew that they had a growing audience interested in hearing what they had to say. We as historians document this story, though we stand outside the generation of which we write. The distance is reduced by empathy, that emotion without which historians are totally lost. We see their hardships and chart their voyage to internment and then to freedom with respect and care. After all, what happened to these men and women, arrested, interned, and deported from what they had hoped to be a safe haven in England or Singapore, could happen to anybody in this room. Dunera Lives is a study of injustice and fortitude, indeed, of survival, recovery, and remembrance. The story we tell in the second volume, and which will be published next year, offers a warning too. Since you, as you read these words or as you hear them, at the very moment you hear them, war and domestic violence rage somewhere in the world. And there, at that place, men, women, and children, just now, are being forced to leave their homes for an uncertain fate and future. Their story is ours as well. It is the story that Ken Inglis told better than anybody else I know. Thank you very much.